welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 20, 38 Across, October 1950. On October 9th, 1950, soldiers of the United States Army crossed the 38th parallel. These were not the first UN soldiers to cross the parallel, though, as soldiers of the Republic of Korea Army crossed the parallel 10 days earlier on September 30th. I mentioned that briefly last week, but we're going to start this week by discussing the actions of the ROKA after they crossed the parallel and the defensive efforts of the Korea People's Army to stop that offensive. We will also discuss the crossing of the parallel by American and British forces that kicked off on October 9th, as well as the Wake Island Conference between Douglas MacArthur and Harry Truman on October 15th. President Syngman Rhee needed very little convincing to approve the ROKA's crossing of the 38th parallel. After an unnecessary explanation from the recently promoted Chief of Staff Chung Il-kwon, who had replaced Chae Byung-dak by this point in the war, Rhee took a note out of his pocket, already written, and handed it to the general. It read, "I am the Commander-in-Chief of the ROK Armed Forces, so I order you to proceed northward." Preparations for the crossing began immediately, in those units where preparations were already underway. To ensure this action wouldn't surprise their American allies, Chung spoke with the U.S. 8th Army's General Walton Walker to confirm the South Korean plans. He was not asking for Walker's permission, just his agreement. At this point in the war, the Republic of Korea Army was still semi-independent from the U.S. Army and the rest of UN forces, even though Rhee had agreed to place the ROKA within the UN command structure. That independence, in the matter of crossing the 38th parallel, can be attributed to the assumption by non-Koreans that the ROKA would cross the parallel after the events of mid-September, regardless of whatever actions the UN forces would or would not take. Facing them were the 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers of the Korea People's Army who successfully retreated back across the parallel. Another 30,000, estimated, were caught behind UN lines, fighting guerrilla actions up through the eastern mountains. The KPA leadership divided the parallel into two defensive zones, simply named the Eastern and the Western zones, to simplify the command structure of the defensive effort. Split between these two zones were the remaining units of the KPA, mostly reorganized into new divisions like the 12th and 27th. They were bolstered by armored divisions that were relatively undermanned, but still were a welcome sight for the weary foot soldiers. That weariness was worsened by the lack of supplies making it to the front lines. Just because they were back in their own country did not mean that the KPA's supply lines were A-OK. When they snapped due to the pressure of Incheon and the stress of operating so far away from North Korea, they did not just snap back to their original setting before the war began. They essentially crumbled and had no way to reset themselves like they could have were a more orderly retreat undertaken. When they were again pressured by UN forces from south of the parallel, it makes sense that the defense would not hold for any serious amount of time. On September 30th, the first South Korean units crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea, followed by the bulk of their comrades in arms the following day. By October 2nd, the 3rd and Capital Divisions of the ROKA had chased the 5th Division of the KPA well into their home territory, establishing division headquarters 10 miles north of the parallel. That chase continued, with ROKA units speeding north when vehicles were available and marching determinedly when they weren't. Orders issued on October 5th by ROKA Command pushed the 3rd and Capital Divisions up to Wonsan as fast as possible in the 1st Corps, with the 2nd Corps advancing through the Taebaek Mountains on the 1st Corps' left flank. The only places where KPA troops put up meaningful resistance were in areas where the defenders had a significant geographic advantage. One such place was the Chorion Pass, that was only traversed after 2 days of difficult fighting in a clever trick by a South Korean major. That major, Chang Chun-kwon, removed the mufflers from some captured trucks to make them sound as loud as tanks, then drove them straight up the pass to frighten the defenders into retreating. His ruse cruise was successful, and his battalion captured Singasan by October 9th, a key town on the path to Wonsan. All along their advance, the ROKA soldiers would find large stores of weapons and supplies, often still wrapped up in their crates and containers. That is a testament to the speed of their advance and the extent of the KPA's collapse at this time. By the end of the day on October 9th, ROK units were just over 2 miles outside of Wonsan. Let's talk about Wonsan for a moment, as it's very important in this phase of the war. By 1950, Wonsan was not the biggest port in Korea, but because the east coast of the peninsula was geographically divided from the western half by mountains, Wonsan grew into the role of one of the main ports on the east coast of Korea. After division, Wonsan became one of the most important ports to the new Democratic People's Republic, simply because it was closer to the Soviet Union's port at Vladivostok than Pyongyang. Wonsan also sits at an important spot on the peninsula, as it more or less marks the neck of the peninsula, the shortest line across the peninsula, when connected to Pyongyang. That's why, as part of their retreat, the KPA planned on putting up a strong defensive effort to hold the strategic city. This started with two defensive lines 10 and 20 kilometers outside of the city, but was focused on a final defensive line tracing the outskirts of the city. Today, it's estimated that about 20,000 soldiers lined up along those lines, backed up by just 12 tanks and a few heavy weapons. The 1st Corps of the ROKA began its attack on October 10th, as American and British soldiers crossed the 38th parallel north of Seoul. At the end of September, the action the UN forces planned to take, or at least the action that MacArthur planned for the UN forces to take, was for X Corps to mount an amphibious invasion of Wonsan, while 8th Army would take control of land operations. After the Wonsan landing, the two groups could draw an offensive line from Pyongyang to Wonsan. From that line, they would advance to the MacArthur Line, which was at least 55 or so miles south of the Yalu River, from which the ROKA could take over offensive operations up to the border. That plan would hopefully not push the Chinese or Soviets into entering the war. Throughout that entire operation, MacArthur wanted X Corps to remain separate from the 8th Army. As before, there were decent enough reasons for this. There would be distinct areas of operation between the two, and Wonsan was best located for extending supply lines into North Korea, given that Incheon and Busan were pretty far away from much of the northern half of the peninsula. Although, I can't help but feel that this was still MacArthur wanting to keep his pet corps directly under his umbrella. One daring amphibious operation was incredible. A second would cement his status as the mightiest of Americans, I'm sure. By October 2nd, this plan was more solidified into a set of orders. I Corps would move to an area north of Seoul to prepare for the advance north to Pyongyang. 9th Corps would take over all responsibilities for ensuring security in South Korea from I Corps and the ROKA, and the ROKA divisions that had not yet crossed the border would advance up to the central corridor of the country alongside I Corps. X Corps would embark on transport ships in Incheon and swing around to Wonsan. As we discussed last week, though, that was easier said than done. Incheon had a narrow harbor that made embarking a lengthier process than expected, delaying the departure of X Corps. And once at sea, those Marines that did not make it on board a ship often just trundled up and down the Korean coast as part of what they called Operation Yo-Yo. By the time X Corps was entirely embarked and ready to go, Wonsan was already captured. The ROKA had beat them to it. That operation to capture Wonsan began on October 10th, with the 3rd and Capital Divisions executing a successful pincer around the city. Once South Koreans entered the city, some confusion ensued in the street fighting, but it was more or less a quick and simple battle. Even a brief counterattack on the night of the 10th did not keep the ROKA from capturing the city by the end of the 11th. Walker flew into Wonsan airfield that day, along with 130 tons of supplies, to meet with the local commanders. The success of their operation could not be diminished by the internal bickering among ROKA staff about which division captured which hill when, because Wonsan was now in UN hands. That would play a crucial role in the next 2 months of the war. On the night of October 8th, the ROKA 2nd Corps began moving towards Wonsan as well, with orders to move along the Pyongyang-Wonsan road to sever a vital link between the two cities while cutting off any retreating KPA units. This was both a supporting operation, but also was important on its own in ensuring that units fleeing from Wonsan weren't just fed directly into the defense of Pyongyang. Only about 90 miles apart, capturing Pyongyang was the next priority. 8th Army would take the lead on that operation, crossing the parallel on the 9th, with the 1st Cavalry Division designated the lead unit, the 24th Division on their left flank, and the ROKA's 1st Division on their right flank. Pak Sun-yup of the 1st Division convinced I Corps' commanding officer, Major General Frank Milburn, that it was important to have Korean units involved in capturing the enemy's capital. Milburn agreed, and the plan was altered to include the 1st Division in the assault on Pyongyang alongside the 1st Cavalry. As on the East Coast, the heaviest resistance UN forces encountered was centered around natural barriers, like the Yesong River. The KPA concentrated mortar and small arms fire along the crossings of this river less than 15 miles north of the parallel, leading to a day of heavy fighting early on in the UN campaign. That, along with heavily mined roads, caused uneven progress across the advancing front. Some units were quick in their advance with little resistance, while others would not even move a mile per day. On October 15th, after 4 days of difficult advance for the UN forces and stalwart defense by the North Koreans, Milburn sent a message to his division commanders. Screw the plan. Whoever captured Sarawon, the largest city on the road to Pyongyang, would earn the right to take Pyongyang alongside the ROKA. Moving into Sarawon took the 1st Cavalry Division, more specifically the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade that was attached to the 1st Cavalry, 2 more days. That same day, the 17th, the ROKA 1st Division was closest to Pyongyang, just 20 miles southeast of the DPRK capital. They had made rapid progress, which was quite astounding to their more mechanized American counterparts. Bolstered by an American tank company upon his request, General Pak prepared his men for the coming battle. In Pyongyang, the Pyongyang Garrison Command had less than 10,000 soldiers available for the capital defense. With 3 divisions quickly bearing down on them, they too prepared for the coming battle. With the outermost defensive line already broken, they hoped that the heavily mined roads on the approach to Pyongyang would buy them some time. All available tanks were buried up to their turrets for protection and camouflage, and mortar crews spread out among the hills and countryside. On the 17th of October, UN forces made first contact with the Pyongyang garrison. The Battle of Pyongyang was on. Early fighting was difficult for both sides, with KPA units harassed by air attack and UN forces harassed by those dug-in KPA units. The Tadong River runs right through the middle of the capital, and has many small tributaries cutting through the countryside south of the city. These crossings posed another challenge to the advancing UN soldiers, as KPA units were usually well located on opposite banks to attack anyone attempting a crossing. Only the cover of darkness gave the advancing soldiers a respite from North Korean small arms and mortar fire. A KPA retreat the night of the 18th surprised the ROKA and their UN allies, as the North Koreans withdrew into Pyongyang for the final defense. That final defense collapsed quickly, as central Pyongyang was captured and occupied by the end of the 19th. 3,000 KPA soldiers were captured in the battle, with about 1,000 of those discovered to be South Korean quote-unquote volunteers forcefully conscripted into service earlier in the war. The collapse of the Pyongyang defense was so abrupt that government officials had little time to pack anything up or burn any important documents. British journalist Reginald Thompson, who had followed UN forces up from Incheon, describes the scene he encountered upon arriving in Pyongyang that same day in his book, Cry Korea. Quote, "We urged our guide to lead us to the nerve center of communist intrigue and power, the seat of the dictator. He led us in some awe to an impressive building on the wooded high ground above the city. This was the Presidium. The whole structure was carefully draped with foliage, almost invisible from the air. On the first floor, quilted double doors led from an antechamber to the impressive inner room of Kim Il-sung. There was the long approach over an expanse of rich, mulberry-colored carpet to the massive, carven, polished desk. Plaster casts of Stalin and Kim Il-sung flanked the desk, and someone had thought to decapitate the communist leader and had gone off with his head, for it was not there. Heavy black silk curtains, crimson-lined, hung from the tall windows, and, but for the headless cast, all was as it had been left by its occupants. The furnishings of the desk were all in place, the deep upholstered chair but recently vacated." End quote. Thompson goes on to describe half-empty beer bottles left on tables at the Russian hotel, the tiny alley-tucked communist Chinese office emptied of anything important, the propaganda posters praising the Russians as gentle and munificent and decrying the Americans as evil and cruel. He reports that, according to those Koreans he spoke with in the city, life in Pyongyang was still normal just 3 days prior, with water and electricity flowing freely. Now, though, riots broke out as people searched out every piece of food available in the city, while soldiers continued fighting through the streets. The Battle of Pyongyang was largely over by the end of the 19th, with the final shots taken on the 20th, and Syngman Rhee welcomed his fellow Koreans back in from the cold on October 27th. Speaking at the municipal offices that once held the People's Committee but were now the seat of a municipal military government, Rhee said, quote, "Let us make up our mind and declare to the international society that we should never allow any foothold for the communists, and that if they, whether Soviets or Chinese, reinvade our territory, then we would fight against them and drive them off to the last." End quote. His appearance was slightly controversial before Rhee spoke, because the United Nations was clear that the Republic of Korea would not have primary jurisdiction over any occupied DPRK territory. That would fall under the purview of the UN military forces until elections for a unified government could be held under the observation of the UN Commission on Korea that so effectively oversaw the elections of 1948. Back in Pyongyang, Rhee importantly did not state that the city was now a part of the ROK, although the Americans were worried that the old president would not be able to help himself. He did state, quite vociferously, that any communist Koreans were in fact not Korean at all. They were animals with the faces of Koreans, and he would do everything he could to eradicate them from Korea. Rhee vowed to forgive those that were truly repentant, but anything less would mark someone a traitor in service of foreign interests. This policy was cemented by the National Assembly on the 28th, with the creation of screening committees that would determine a North Korean's fitness for citizenship in the ROK. As a continuation of Rhee's statements in Pyongyang, if a person was not cleared by their local committees, the punishment was often death, no matter the reason for one's working with the previous administration. Back on the East Coast, X-Corps was having a rough go of things. After leaving Incheon, they moved to Busan, then up towards Wonsan, but, as we know now, Wonsan was already captured. A landing was unnecessary. Furthermore, Wonsan's harbor was heavily mined. Minesweeping operations would take a long time and would ultimately exact a hefty price for their removal in terms of minesweepers lost. The beaches were also mined, but clearing those was a bit easier. There's a darkly amusing anecdote to come out of the mine-clearing operations around Wonsan. As written by Stanley Weintraub, quote, "ROK soldiers had stacked about 1,000 20-pound mines at the north end of the harbor. A group of 5 or 6 men stayed behind to party on the beach after stacking the mines, apparently with strong drink. Standing just 200 yards away from the mines, one of the men fired his pistol at the inviting pile. Panes of glass in building 2 miles away were shattered by the resulting explosion." End quote. The harbor mines were not easily cleared, meaning a landing could not occur at Wonsan at this time. For the Marines offshore, Operation Yo-Yo would continue until a suitable location for their offloading could be found. The last thing I want to discuss today is the only meeting between the Supreme Commander and his Commander-in-Chief. On October 10th, Truman issued a statement to the press that he and MacArthur were to meet on Wake Island in 5 days' time. Wake Island is a U.S. military outpost about 2,000 miles southeast of Tokyo, 2,300 miles west of Honolulu, and 4,400 miles southwest of San Francisco. When I say this was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I really mean it was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But as a military outpost before the advent of the jet age, that is the perfect position. Wake Island was well situated to be a refueling stop for aircraft traversing the massive Pacific, operating in conjunction with Hawaii and Guam. It was also well situated for a conference between MacArthur and Truman. Truman did not want MacArthur to have to travel far for a comparatively short conversation, so on the night of October 14th, MacArthur traveled to Wake Island and awaited his commander-in-chief. Truman landed 12 hours later, at 6:30 in the morning on the 15th. The general greeted him with a hearty handshake and the two adjourned for a private conversation in a small concrete building. Now, no one knows for sure what was said in that conversation. We can make some educated guesses about it, though, once we look around at the state of the war and the state of the world around the war. Truman surely asked MacArthur about his opinion on a Chinese entrance into the war, to which MacArthur would probably respond that he could handle anything the Chinese would throw at him. They probably discussed an allegedly accidental air raid against a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok by American aircraft about a week before the conference. MacArthur presumably responded by saying he would punish those responsible, which he did upon his return to Tokyo. During the next meeting of the conference, between the general and the president, with their staffs and advisors present, the semi-official record shows MacArthur scoffing at the idea that the Chinese intervention was probable, if not already in motion. MacArthur would of course deny this, given later events, but given that the stenographer taking those semi-official notes was on Truman's staff and just on the other side of a thin wicker door that was hardly closed during the meeting, I'm inclined to believe that MacArthur's hubris was very apparent in his answers to Truman's questions. According to the notes, MacArthur predicted that the war would be over by Christmas, which is always a sign that things are about to get much, much worse. Luckily for him, the old general never specified which Christmas. The Wake Island Conference was a welcome meeting between the two leaders, and it gave both the opportunity to clarify things that were often left to implication and interpretation. This meeting, for the briefest of moments, bolstered the president's faith in his general, still high from the successes at Incheon and Busan. That faith would soon come crashing down in the face of a Chinese wave. After their meeting ended, Truman and MacArthur went their separate ways. This was the first time MacArthur had set foot on American soil in 20 years, and it would be the last time he would leave Japan, save for trips to Korea, before he was fired by Truman just 6 months later. As relayed by Weintraub, MacArthur would later write in his memoirs that he noticed, quote, "The original courageous decision of Harry Truman to boldly meet and defeat communism in Asia was apparently being chipped away by the constant whispers of timidity and cynicism." MacArthur was upset by the lack of conviction he found in his superiors, for they did not share his dream of expanding the war against the communists in China and Russia. This was not the largest his appetite for war would grow, but we'll cover that soon enough. As Reginald Thompson's plane picked itself back up to Kpa Airfield from Pyongyang, Thompson writes the following, quote, "I had a feeling that a distinct phase of the war was over, and that something new and terrible might be beginning. I wanted to think, to try to digest and evaluate all this mass of experience since the Incheon landing. Besides, all at once, we felt divorced from the larger world. What was going on? What was the impact of all this? Were we alone in our terror of MacArthur's megalomania and delusions of grandeur? Perhaps by now other and more important events elsewhere were occupying the minds of men." End quote. Across the Yalu River, something was in the works that would snap everyone's attention back to Korea. The Korean War was about to, again, enter a new phase. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with United Nations forces getting ever closer to the Yalu River. Next week, we will discuss the entrance of the People's Republic of China into the Korean War at the end of October alongside the continued advance of UN forces towards the Manchurian border. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.